What if the Jewish revolt had overthrown Roman rule? If the Second Temple had not burned, if a defiant mountain fortress had become the birthplace of a Jewish empire, if the rebels of Judea had shattered the Roman yoke, would the Middle East still be the crucible of empires it is today? Or would the world kneel to a very different idea of destiny? History remembers the Great Jewish Revolt as a doomed struggle, a final cry of resistance crushed beneath the might of Roman legions. In 70 CE, flames consumed the Sacred Heart of Jerusalem. The Second Temple, the spiritual core of Judaism, collapsed into ash, and with it, a nation's hope. But what if that story ended differently? To understand what could have been, we must first walk the bloodied stones of what truly was. By the 1st century CE, Judea was a land simmering with unrest, a Roman province in name, but never in soul. Heavy taxation, religious disrespect, and a brutal military presence had ignited a deep resentment. The people of Judea viewed the Romans not as governors, but as defilers of their covenant with God. It was only a matter of time before revolt became inevitable. In 66 CE, it began. The Sicarii and Zealots, radical Jewish factions, assassinated Roman officials, seized strongholds, and declared open rebellion. The governor of Syria attempted to crush the revolt, but was ambushed. His legion was annihilated. For a brief moment, Jerusalem was free. Rome, naturally, responded with fire and steel. Emperor Nero dispatched his top general, Vespasian, who waged a brutal campaign across Galilee and the Judean countryside. Town by town, rebellion was snuffed out, until only Jerusalem remained. Then Nero died, and the empire convulsed. In the chaos of 69 CE, Rome's year of the four emperors, Vespasian abandoned the siege to claim the imperial throne. Command fell to his son, Titus, and here, in this fracture of Roman power, our alternate world begins. In this new timeline, the rebels recognize the opening and act. Rather than descend into infighting, the Zealots and Pharisees form an unlikely alliance. Under a single charismatic general, Shimon ben Jorah, the fragmented Jewish factions unify for the first time. As Rome devours itself in civil war, Judea becomes more than just a rebellion. It becomes a revolution with a vision. Supplies are stockpiled. Fortifications around Jerusalem are strengthened. Secret alliances are forged with Parthian agents in the east, Rome's eternal rival. And in one critical night, a Roman supply convoy bound for Titus is ambushed outside Jericho. The loss is devastating. Siege equipment burns in the desert, and morale among the Romans begins to falter. Then, Jerusalem strikes. Under cover of darkness, Jewish forces launch a coordinated counteroffensive. Using knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and stolen Roman engineering, they push Titus's forces back. By the time Roman reinforcements arrive from Alexandria, it is too late. Jerusalem still stands, the temple still rises. And then, something unthinkable happens. The Roman legions retreat. The Judean rebels have not just survived, they have won. But what now? Jerusalem celebrates, but the region holds its breath. Rome, humiliated. Judea, triumphant. And history, forever changed. In the silence that follows the Roman withdrawal, the question emerges like a tremor in the sand. Will Judea become a footnote in Roman embarrassment, or the seed of something greater? That answer begins to take shape as the rebels turn their eyes beyond the city walls. The morning after Rome's retreat, Jerusalem woke not to silence, but to disbelief. Smoke still curled from the torched remains of Roman camps, and fallen legionaries littered the rocky hills like relics of a world overturned. The great city had bled, but it had not fallen. And in the shadows of the temple, now fully intact and defiantly golden, a new question rippled through the crowds. What happens when a people who were never meant to win do? The victory was more than military. It was spiritual. For centuries, prophets had spoken of deliverance. Now, standing atop the remnants of the most powerful empire in the world, the Jewish people saw themselves not merely as survivors, but as instruments of divine design. This wasn't the end of Roman rule. It was the beginning of Jewish sovereignty. But revolution is one thing. Nation building is another. Shimon ben Giora, once a commander of guerrilla fighters, now found himself hailed as a king. Reluctant at first, he accepted the title Nasi, prince, echoing the ancient Hasmonean tradition. His leadership, forged in blood and desperation, now had to evolve into governance. A council of sages, priests, and former rebels was assembled in the restored temple courtyard to draft a new charter. This wasn't to be a monarchy in the Roman mold, but something else entirely. A fusion of the Torah and pragmatic governance, a theocratic republic, a second commonwealth. And yet, the dangers had only just begun. Rome had not forgotten. Across the sea, in the newly stabilized heart of the empire, Vespasian seethed. His son's retreat was a stain on imperial honor. But rebuilding legions would take time. Civil wars had drained the treasury, and the Danube frontier was once again aflame with barbarian incursions. Judea, for now, was too distant to reconquer, but not forever. In the breathing space of reprieve, Judea moved fast. Envoys were sent east to Parthia, the old enemy of Rome, with a bold proposition: recognition in exchange for alliance. The Parthians, ever eager to chip at Roman influence, agreed. What emerged was a pact of iron and gold, mutual defense, trade routes restored through Babylon, and a bridge between Jerusalem and the Persian highlands. But alliances alone do not make a state secure. Judea turned inward. Militias were reorganized into a standing army, the Maccabean Guard, named to evoke the warriors of old. Fortresses across Galilee and the Negev were rebuilt, not as isolated redoubts, but as nodes in a unified defense network. Roads were repaired, coins minted, and for the first time in nearly a century, Hebrew became the administrative language of a sovereign state. The cultural revival was staggering. Rabbinic schools flourished in the absence of Roman censorship. Pilgrims flooded Jerusalem not as subjugated subjects, but as citizens. The Sanhedrin, once powerless under Roman oversight, became the guiding moral and legal force behind the nation, and all of it centered around the temple, now more than a place of worship. It was a symbol of resilience, a physical embodiment of national identity. Yet cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The Zealots, who had fought for a land ruled by God alone, bristled at even the softest hints of pragmatism. Trade with Gentile nations, diplomatic pacts, internal taxation. These, to the most devout, were compromises bordering on betrayal. A sect led by Eleazar ben Yair, a veteran of the Masada fortress, began preaching isolationism. Better a nation alone with God, he proclaimed, than a kingdom tangled in the affairs of men. The seeds of civil division, once buried by the urgency of war, had begun to sprout. But Judea had no time to nurse old wounds. News arrived like thunder from the north. Rome was building again. Vespasian had forged a new army. German auxiliaries, Syrian mercenaries, and remnants of the eastern legions were gathering under a single banner. A Roman eagle now faced east once more. And this time, they would not stop at Jerusalem. As the drums of war echoed once more across the Mediterranean, Judea faced a chilling truth. Victory was not survival. Victory had made them a target. In the spring of 73 CE, the sea turned hostile. Roman sails, black against the silver Mediterranean, reappeared off the coast of Caesarea. After 3 years of shame and silence, Rome had returned, not to negotiate, but to erase. Vespasian, now secure as emperor, had a message to deliver to the world. Rome may stagger, but it never forgets, and it never forgives. This new force was not the army that once fumbled in the hills of Judea. It was leaner, meaner, hardened by battles on the Rhine and Euphrates. The legate leading the campaign, General Marcus Aelius Silvanus, had earned his reputation suppressing revolts in Gaul. He studied the previous failures in Judea not as misfortune, but as lessons. His motto was etched into every banner: Celeritas, Disciplina, Terror, Speed, Discipline, Terror. In Jerusalem, the mood shifted. The celebration of independence faded into a drumbeat of preparation. Once again, the city's walls were reinforced, but this time, so were its people. The Maccabean Guard was deployed northward, fortifying mountain passes and desert routes. They weren't fighting for liberation now, they were fighting for survival. But the battle for Judea wouldn't begin on land. It began at sea. Silvanus's fleet landed at Ptolemais, then swept south, seizing Gaza and Jaffa with stunning speed. The Roman grip tightened along the coastline, cutting off Judea from vital Mediterranean trade. This wasn't conquest. It was siege by strangulation. The Jewish response was equally ruthless. Parthian cavalry from the east harassed Roman supply lines, while Jewish insurgents, trained in the narrow alleys of Hebron and Safed, ambushed Roman columns and vanished into the hills. These were not civilians with daggers. These were soldiers of a new state, and they fought not just with weapons, but with purpose. Still, the enemy pressed on. By late summer, Silvanus reached the outskirts of Jerusalem. He did not attack immediately. Instead, he built a wall, manit, around the city. It was a tactic as psychological as it was strategic. A siege within a siege, a mirror to the one his predecessor had failed to complete. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, and inside the walls, the fractures of Judea's internal politics returned with venom. The Zealots, still bitter over political compromise, accused the Nazis' council of weakness. Eleazar ben Yair's followers staged a raid on the temple's granary, sparking a week of street fighting. Fire consumed a quarter of the lower city before Shimon's guard restored order. But the damage was done. Unity, that rarest of weapons, was broken. And outside, Rome was watching. Then, in the darkest hour, the unexpected happened. A sandstorm, massive, biblical, descended from the Judean wilderness. For 3 days, the air turned red. Roman encampments scattered. Silvanus lost 2 cohorts to disarray and dehydration. Judean scouts used the chaos to break the siege wall in 3 places, smuggling in fresh supplies and Parthian reinforcements through hidden tunnels near the Kidron Valley. When the storm cleared, Jerusalem still stood. Silvanus had lost momentum, and worse, he had lost control of the narrative. Across the eastern provinces, whispers began to spread. The gods favored Judea. But Shimon ben Giora knew better. He knew Rome never gave up, that this was just the beginning of a long war that would stretch not for months but years. And so, under torchlight deep beneath the temple, he convened his council, not to plan defense, but to ask a forbidden question. What if they took the war to Rome? The room fell silent. It was madness, or was it salvation? Because for every day Rome attacked Judea, Judea bled. But if Judea attacked Roman provinces, if they spread the war beyond Jerusalem's walls, they might force a negotiation, or even a reckoning. As scouts returned with news of unrest in Syria and Egypt, the decision was made. Judea would go on the offensive, not for conquest, but for survival. And far beyond the Jordan, a new banner began to rise. The war crossed the Jordan like a rising tide. For years, Judea had fought on its own soil, its valleys scorched, its cities scarred. But now, for the first time in living memory, the children of David were not defending. They were advancing. It began with fire. In the fall of 73 CE, a force of 5,000 Judean infantry and Parthian cavalry slipped eastward under the cover of moonless nights. Their target was not Roman soldiers, but Roman infrastructure. Aqueducts, grain depots, and garrisons across the Decapolis were hit with precision. Gerasa, a once thriving Romanized city, woke to find its citadel burning and its governor vanished. By the time Roman scouts arrived, the rebels had already moved on, leaving behind only the shattered seal of Caesar, trampled into the dirt. The message was clear. The Judeans would not wait to die within their walls. In Petra, whispers spread faster than flames. Nabatean merchants, long resentful of Rome's taxes and monopolies, began supplying Judean outposts with water and camels. In Damascus, Jewish diaspora communities, fearful but inspired, began funneling gold and silver into the rebellion. And in Egypt, the grain fleets to Rome were disrupted by saboteurs bearing no flag, only the mark of the temple. Rome was stunned. This wasn't a revolt. It was a regional contagion. And Silvanus, still encamped outside Jerusalem, now found his lines stretched thin. Reinforcements, instead of arriving, were being diverted to defend Syria and Arabia. His siege, already shaken by storm and supply disruption, now stood on the brink of collapse. But Shimon ben Giora wasn't celebrating. He understood the cost of widening the war. The further they pushed into Roman territory, the more brutally Rome would respond. And in his war room beneath Jerusalem, he uttered a prophecy, not in scripture, but in strategy. If we burn too fast, we burn alone. Still, the war council agreed. The offensive must continue. By early 74 CE, a second Judean column moved into the Sinai Peninsula. Their goal? Disrupt the Via Maris, Rome's primary overland trade route between Egypt and Syria. The results were astonishing. A single ambush near Pelusium destroyed a Roman caravan carrying salaries for garrisons across 2 provinces. Discontent rippled through the ranks. Mutinies broke out in Alexandria. Roman soldiers, unpaid and cut off, began abandoning their posts. Meanwhile, in Babylon, the Parthian king Vologases I saw an opportunity. For decades, Parthia had tested Rome's borders in minor skirmishes. But now, with Rome distracted and reeling, Vologases mobilized. Thousands of horse archers surged toward Armenia and Cappadocia, not under Judean banners, but in synchronized purpose. The Roman East was unraveling. In the Senate, panic replaced pride. Judea, once dismissed as a backwater of fanatics, was now the eye of a storm threatening the entire Eastern Empire. A motion was raised. Should Rome attempt a negotiated settlement? The motion was crushed. Vespasian, wary of appearing weak, rejected all talk of peace. "Let no man speak of treaties," he declared. "We do not parley with heresy." And so, Rome did what Rome always did. It escalated. A new general, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, a veteran of Germanic campaigns and famed for his iron discipline, was recalled from semi-retirement. His orders were absolute. Crush the rebellion, pacify the East, restore Roman glory. With him came 2 full legions, 20,000 men drawn from the heart of the empire. This wasn't a cleanup. This was an extermination. But Judea was ready. The rebels had learned from Rome. They understood terrain, supply, morale. And they now had allies, not just Parthians, but disaffected tribes, desert merchants, and colonists weary of Roman overreach. They weren't merely rebels anymore. They were the spine of a new regional order. As spring turned to summer, all eyes turned to Damascus, where Corbulo and Shimon's forward commanders would soon meet. The ancient city, neutral until now, braced itself, because what would happen there would decide the fate of the East, and perhaps the soul of empire itself. The air above Damascus was heavy with omens. It was midsummer, 74 CE, and the desert shimmered with a dry heat that warped even the sharpest spearhead. Beneath this heat, 2 armies stared across a narrow stretch of olive groves and stone farms, one under the crimson banners of Rome, the other beneath the lion standard of a resurrected Judea. This was no border skirmish. This was no ambush in the hills. This was war declared with full voice. Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, towering in iron-gray armor, had not come for negotiation. He had studied Shimon ben Giora's strategies, consulted the failures of Silvanus, and marched across Anatolia with the finest of Rome's surviving eastern legions. Corbulo was no brute. He was a builder, a disciplinarian, and a man who believed in order, at any cost. Facing him was General Mattathias ben Levi, a former priest-turned-commander, one of Shimon's most trusted officers. Unlike Corbulo, Mattathias knew defeat. He had seen Jerusalem burn during the early revolts, and he wore the memory like armor. But he also knew something Corbulo didn't. He knew how deeply his soldiers believed. The Judean force was outnumbered, 14,000 men to Corbulo's 20,000, but they held the high ground near the Abana River and were reinforced by Parthian cavalry operating from the east. Their tactics would not be to stand and trade blows, but to bleed Rome slowly, strike, vanish, strike again. Corbulo, aware of this, chose not to advance. Instead, he waited, for days. He built a ring of wooden towers around his camp, dug trenches to funnel cavalry, posted guards in shifts so regular that even the desert ants seemed to march to his schedule. He was daring Mattathias to make the first move. And Mattathias did. On the fourth night, under the cover of a desert windstorm, Judean scouts crept into Corbulo's forward supply line and set the grain reserves ablaze. It was a brutal blow, but it was a calculated one. Corbulo had anticipated it. A decoy stockpile had been left exposed, while the real reserves were buried beneath layered stone caches to survive sabotage. The trap had been laid. Now it was time to spring it. At dawn, Corbulo unleashed a flanking maneuver that took Judean scouts by surprise. 2 Roman cohorts swept in from the southwest, aiming to cut Mattathias off from the Parthian riders stationed beyond the river. But the Judean general was faster than expected. Rather than retreat or hold ground, he collapsed his forward lines deliberately, luring the Romans deeper into terrain they thought they understood. And then came the horn, a low, trembling call that echoed across the hills like thunder on dry bones. From the ridges above, Judean slingers emerged in volleys. Trained since youth in the canyons of Ein Gedi, they rained precision chaos on Roman lines. Behind them, camouflaged ballistae, dragged up overnight and hidden beneath desert netting, let loose with terrifying accuracy. Dozens of Roman shields splintered before the infantry could reform. Then, like smoke across dry wheat, the Parthian cavalry surged. Fast, silent, lethal. From the eastern dunes they descended, horses wrapped in chainmail, bows already loosed before the Romans could blink. Not even Corbulo's discipline could withstand such multi-directional fury. For 6 hours, the fields outside Damascus became a graveyard. Rome fought hard. Corbulo's officers rallied broken formations, even managed to punch a hole through the Judean right flank. But the cost was catastrophic. By sunset, over 8,000 Roman soldiers lay dead or wounded. Corbulo himself was thrown from his horse and barely escaped with a fractured arm and shattered pride. But Mattathias did not pursue. He allowed the Romans to limp westward, back toward Antioch. Because the victory was not just military, it was symbolic. For the first time in centuries, a Jewish army had defeated a full Roman legion in open field combat, outside their own territory, on foreign ground, in full view of Rome's eastern provinces. The message was as loud as it was clear. Judea was no longer merely resisting Rome. It was replacing it. In Damascus, the city's leaders emerged from hiding and opened their gates, not to Rome, but to Mattathias. There was no conquest, no looting, just an offer, autonomy in exchange for neutrality. The city accepted, and thus, Damascus became the first major Roman city to realign its loyalty, willingly, with the new Judean Commonwealth. But as the temple bells rang in Jerusalem and prayers of thanksgiving filled the air, Shimon ben Giora remained silent. He knew Rome would never accept this, and as messengers arrived bearing news of reinforcements from the west, of Caesar's fury rekindled, of Germanic auxiliaries crossing into Asia Minor, he knew something darker was coming. Not retaliation, but annihilation. Rome does not forgive. The news of Damascus reached the Eternal City like a dagger cloaked in smoke. Whispers turned to outrage. Senators slammed their fists on marble tables. In the streets, citizens demanded vengeance. The defeat of Corbulo, a general of near mythic stature, was not merely a loss on the frontier. It was an insult to the very soul of the empire. Vespasian, once a soldier, now a calculating emperor, convened his inner circle behind closed doors. There would be no more limited engagements, no more hesitant campaigns. This rebellion, once seen as a minor uprising in a distant desert, had become a threat to Roman prestige across the East. And so, in the winter of 74 CE, Vespasian ordered the unthinkable. The mobilization of the 10th and 12th legions, veterans of Gaul, veterans of Germania, men trained in the art of extermination. Their destination, Judea. Their purpose, total eradication. But vengeance came with a price. To fund the campaign, Rome imposed emergency taxes on the provinces, taxes so harsh that even the merchant elite of Alexandria and Antioch began to murmur dissent. Grain exports to Rome slowed. Trade convoys were attacked not by rebels, but by desperate citizens of the empire itself. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier teetered. Parthia, emboldened by the Judean victories, seized the moment. King Vologeses launched a surprise assault on Armenia, claiming it as a buffer state against Roman aggression. As Rome turned east, its grip on the Danube weakened. Germanic tribes, sensing opportunity, crossed in scattered waves. The empire, stretched thin, began to creak. Inside Rome, another crack formed. A faction within the Senate, led by the pragmatic Lucius Calpurnius Piso, began to speak quietly of peace. Piso argued that the rebellion was not a threat to Rome's survival, but to its illusion of control. If we lose the East, he warned, we lose coins and grain. If we lose the people's faith in our invincibility, we lose the empire. Vespasian dismissed him. But Piso was not alone. In the shadows of the Curia Julia, alliances began to form, not with swords, but with letters. Secret emissaries reached out to Shimon ben Giora. They offered terms, autonomy, tribute instead of conquest, the right to worship, to govern, to live. But Shimon was no longer a rebel seeking survival. He was a ruler facing a crossroad. His war council was split. Some urged acceptance. After all, peace with honor was once unimaginable. Others warned it was a trap. Eleazar ben Yair, increasingly radicalized and preaching messianic triumph, declared that any treaty with Rome was blasphemy. "We are not survivors," he thundered. "We are a sword in God's hand. Let it fall." And then came the signs. Not omens from the heavens, but smoke from the west. The 12th Legion had landed. They swept through the Levant like wildfire, razing coastal towns, crucifying any who resisted, enslaving thousands. Caesarea fell in a day, Jaffa in 3. The Judean coast was once again under Roman control. But this time, the rebels did not wait. Shimon ordered a mass evacuation of Galilee. Farms were torched so nothing could be taken. Villages emptied. Children and elders moved south under armed protection. The strategy was brutal but necessary. Deny Rome the ability to feed itself on conquered land. And then, Jerusalem closed its gates. This time, it would not be caught unprepared. Tunnels beneath the city were reinforced, granaries packed with salted meat and dried figs, water systems restored, siege engines constructed. For the first time since the days of David, the city was armed like a capital prepared to outlast empires. But in doing so, it had become something else, a symbol. To Jews across the diaspora, to oppressed peoples across the East, Jerusalem became a beacon, not of religion alone, but of resistance. In Alexandria, riots erupted in support of the rebellion. In Cyrene, Roman outposts were attacked by men chanting prayers in Hebrew. In Mesopotamia, Persian priests began blessing the Judean flag as a holy banner. But inside the city walls, the cost of legend was beginning to show. Food, while stored, was not infinite. The council debated how long they could hold out. Shimon, aging and increasingly isolated, began to fear the one thing even Rome had failed to destroy: division from within. And on the horizon, smoke once more rose. The 12th Legion was not coming to negotiate. They were coming to finish what Titus had begun. But this time, Jerusalem was not only a city, it was an idea. And ideas, as Rome was learning, are far harder to kill than kings. In the spring of 75 CE, the sun rose blood-red over the hills of Judea. Beneath it, a vast machine of death advanced. The 12th Legion, flanked by auxiliaries from Thrace and Numidia, reached the walls of Jerusalem for the second time in less than a decade. But this time, they brought more than ladders and swords. They brought hunger, Rome had learned. The previous siege had been brute force, direct assaults, battering rams, and fire. It failed. This time, the strategy was slow, methodical, and terrifying, napaining in its precision. The legions encircled the city with fortified camps, cutting off every known trail, every hidden valley pass. Even the ancient aqueducts were sealed. Jerusalem, a city of over 150,000 souls, was now a sealed chamber of breathless silence. But inside, the heart still beat. Unlike in 70 CE, the city was ready. Food stores were buried beneath stone cisterns. A military rationing system, modeled after Roman logistics, ensured discipline. The Maccabean Guard patrolled every market, every alley, every synagogue, not with fear, but with resolve. The people had chosen this. They would endure it. On the Temple Mount, Shimon ben Giora stood once more beneath the golden colonnades, older now, slower, but no less sharp. He addressed the council, the generals, and the priests in one breath. If Rome wants our blood, we will make them pay for every drop. And if the temple must fall, let it fall on their heads. But behind his strength was fear, not of death, but of fragmentation. Inside the city, unity was fraying. The radicals, led by Eleazar ben Yair, refused to abide by rationing laws. They accused Shimon of blasphemy for storing food in the temple courts. "This house," Eleazar roared, "was built for sacrifice to God, not barley for men." Small riots erupted. Twice, the guard had to seize hidden arms caches from zealot cells attempting to overthrow the council. Shimon, once hailed as the savior of Judea, now faced whispers that he had become its tyrant. Outside the walls, Rome waited. General Gaius Septimius Varro, a cruel but efficient commander, oversaw the siege with mathematical detachment. He knew he didn't need to storm the gates. He needed only time. Disease, thirst, and starvation siege would be his battering rams. To break the morale, Varro unleashed psychological warfare. Crucifixions, dozens each day, lined the hills. Captured messengers were sent back flayed and disfigured. Catapults hurled rotting carcasses over the walls to spread plague. At night, drums thundered just outside earshot, keeping the city awake in perpetual tension. Rome was not just besieging a city, it was trying to break a legend. But Jerusalem didn't break, not yet. In a daring move, the Judeans launched a night raid through a forgotten cistern tunnel, emerging behind Roman lines and setting fire to a supply depot near the Mount of Olives. Dozens of siege engines were destroyed. For a brief moment, cheers rang from the rooftops of the old city, but joy turned quickly to ash. 2 days later, Eleazar and his faction seized control of the inner temple, declaring it a sanctuary that would no longer serve the war effort. He called for an end to political authority, proclaiming God alone as ruler. The city was now fighting a siege from within. Shimon had no choice. He gave the order. In a dawn assault, the Maccabean Guard stormed the inner court. Blood was spilled not by Romans, but by brothers. Eleazar was captured, wounded, and imprisoned beneath the hall of hewn stone. His followers were disarmed, but their message echoed. Jerusalem might outlast Rome, but could it outlast itself? As the summer heat set in, the wells ran dry. Even the rationed food began to turn. Children no longer played in the streets. The songs of prayer became whispers. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, an omen. A tremor, brief but unmistakable, shook the foundation of the temple. Some called it a warning from God. Others feared it was the prelude to collapse. Outside the gates, Rome was preparing the final phase, a triple assault, coordinated across 3 fronts, backed by siege towers unlike anything Jerusalem had faced before. Inside the walls, Shimon ben Giora, sleepless, hollow-eyed, stood at the western gate with his remaining commanders. "This city," he whispered, "is no longer ours to save." But still, they would fight. Not for conquest, not even for survival, but for memory, for the hope that centuries later someone would say, they stood. It began at dawn, 3 hours before the sun breached the Mount of Olives. In the pale blue hush of early morning, Rome moved. Trumpets cut the silence like razors. From the northern ridge, siege towers, creaking with iron tension, lurched forward, each one cloaked in damp hides to resist fire. Behind them, the 12th Legion advanced in disciplined silence, shields raised, eyes locked forward. To the west, battering rams hammered the city's gates in rhythmic unison, like war drums made of oak and rage. And from the south, where the walls were weakest, Gaius Septimius Vero unleashed his final weapon: tunnels. For weeks, Roman sappers had worked beneath the city, carving through bedrock, bracing walls with timber, calculating every inch. That morning, they lit the supports and pulled back. The ground near the lower city shuddered, then buckled. A 20-meter section of the wall collapsed in a groan of stone and dust. Jerusalem was open, but the city did not fall. The Maccabean guard met the breach like a thunderclap. Archers lined rooftops, targeting officers. Boiling oil was poured from balconies. Even civilians fought, hurling stones, fire, anything. In the alleyways, every turn became a trap. Roman formations faltered, and for hours, blood ran thicker than water in the city's ancient drains. On the Temple Mount, Shimon ben Giora stood in full armor for the first time in weeks. His face, gaunt and hollow, had lost its fury, but not its purpose. He sent his final orders. All remaining forces were to fall back to the upper city and defend the temple to the last man. This would not be a retreat. This would be a stand written into eternity. Meanwhile, imprisoned beneath the temple complex, Eleazar ben Yair listened as stone cracked above him. Though wounded and silenced, he had become a symbol. Some of his followers escaped confinement and began preaching in secret. The fall of Jerusalem was not defeat, but purification. That out of fire would come a new covenant. Rome pressed on. By mid-afternoon, the lower city was ablaze. Vero, ruthless and unmoved, ordered no quarter. Houses were torched. Families slaughtered. Even captured fighters were crucified immediately. He wanted no prisoners, only silence. But the temple refused to burn. Its gates were barred, its walls reinforced with marble and faith, and within, thousands of defenders prepared for the final assault. Priests and soldiers alike stood shoulder to shoulder. Scrolls were hidden in stone vaults, relics buried beneath the floor. Whatever survived would not be captured, but saved for an age yet to come. Then the western gate gave way. Roman troops flooded the temple courtyards. The fighting turned hand to hand, vicious and desperate. Spears shattered. Swords dulled. Bodies piled atop bodies. Shimon ben Giora led the defense personally. He fought not like a general, but like a man with nothing left to lose. In the shadow of the Holy of Holies, surrounded by fire and ruin, he was struck down, pierced through the chest by a Roman javelin. He died where he had once preached unity, and where his dream had nearly come true. The temple burned at sunset, not by Roman order, but by accident. A flaming arrow loosed in chaos struck the inner sanctuary. The wood of Lebanon, ancient and dry, ignited in seconds. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Even the Romans, stunned by the inferno, halted their slaughter. Vero watched it burn. There was no triumph in his face, only exhaustion. Jerusalem had fallen. But Rome had paid dearly. Over 10,000 dead. Dozens of officers lost. Months of siege. Mountains of gold spent. And across the east, revolt still simmered. Judea had been crushed. But the fire it lit would take decades to smother. In the days that followed, survivors were marched in chains. The temple ruins were declared damnatio memoriae, erased from Roman records. A new city, Aelia Capitolina, would be built atop the ashes. But nothing truly ended. In Babylon, Parthian scholars composed poems in honor of Judean valor. In Alexandria, Jewish merchants wore black armbands for a year, and in Rome, whispers returned to the Senate chamber. If it had taken this much to crush one city, what would it take to crush a movement? One Roman historian, writing in secret, posed the question, have we won, or have we only delayed something greater? And somewhere, buried deep beneath the scorched foundations of the temple, a sealed stone chamber held the last scrolls of the council, unopened, unread, waiting for a world yet to come. Jerusalem was gone, but the idea of Jerusalem, that Rome could not kill. The smoke of Jerusalem clung to the wind for weeks, drifting east across the Jordan, west to the sea, and north toward Antioch, where Roman governors watched with a strange blend of triumph and dread. The city was gone, reduced to rubble and legend, but the questions it left behind were not so easily buried. For Rome, the cost of victory was profound. The campaign to crush Judea had drained imperial coffers dry. The emergency taxations, once seen as temporary, became permanent. Riots broke out in Carthage and Alexandria. In Gaul, veterans of the 12th Legion returned not as heroes, but as shadows, scarred, haunted, and disillusioned. The victory parade held in Rome was a pale imitation of triumphs past. The crowds applauded, yes, but the applause was thin, hollow. Even the temple gold paraded through the streets could not mask the truth. Something had changed. The Jewish resistance had exposed a weakness, not in Rome's armies, but in its soul. An empire that once conquered through awe and assimilation had resorted to annihilation. It had won, but not persuaded. And beneath the surface, that weakness spread. In the eastern provinces, sympathy for the Judean cause lingered like embers in a dry forest. The Parthians, emboldened by Judea's defiance, seized key Roman outposts in Armenia with little resistance. In Arabia, new cults emerged, blending local gods with tales of Jerusalem's last stand, preaching salvation through endurance, through purity, through fire. Even among the conquered Jews, something began to stir. Not rebellion, not yet, but memory. In Babylon, the surviving sages of the Sanhedrin, secretly smuggled out of Jerusalem weeks before its fall, established a new yeshiva near the banks of the Euphrates. There, under the shadow of palm trees instead of cedars, the oral traditions were written down, refined, preserved. These teachings would become the foundation of a movement no longer bound by temple or land, but by law and thought, a Judaism reborn in exile, sharper, quieter, but no less resilient. The idea of a sovereign Judea had been crushed, but the idea of a chosen people had survived and adapted. Ironically, the destruction of the temple unleashed something the Romans never anticipated: dispersion as multiplication. Jews fleeing the flames of Jerusalem settled across the empire, into Gaul, Hispania, Mesopotamia, and even the Germanic frontiers. Each new community carried the story of resistance. Each synagogue became a whisper of what had once been and what might rise again. And for Rome, the war's spiritual consequences ran even deeper. In the provinces, strange new sects began to attract attention. Followers of a crucified Jewish teacher who had once been dismissed as fringe cultists now found renewed relevance in the tale of Jerusalem's fall. They spoke of sacrifice, of divine justice, of kingdoms not of this world. And increasingly, they framed the temple's destruction not as a defeat, but as prophecy fulfilled. These sects, fractured, diverse, often at odds, began to coalesce into a more coherent voice. And their message was clear: the age of emperors was ending, the age of spiritual empires was beginning. Rome, unwittingly, had sown the seeds of its own transformation. Back in the east, the remnants of the Maccabean Guard had not all perished. Some vanished into the hills of Judea. Others crossed into Parthia, offering their services as mercenaries. But a few, only a few, slipped through the Levantine coast under assumed names, carrying with them relics, scrolls, and fragments of the once glorious council. One such group reached Cyprus, then Crete, And finally, the coast of southern Italia. There, in quiet mountain villages, they planted communities not with weapons, but with words. They shared stories of Shimon ben Giora, of the night raids, of the fire that consumed but did not destroy. These weren't tales of martyrdom. They were blueprints. The memory of resistance became a virus in the bloodstream of empire. Over the following decades, Rome would face rebellion after rebellion, not always Jewish, not always religious, but always rooted in the same seed, the belief that power built only on fear will one day fall. Jerusalem had shown the world that even the smallest nation, when unified by faith and purpose, could wound the mightiest empire. And though the city lay buried beneath Roman stone, something far more dangerous had survived. An idea, one that could not be crucified, nor burned, nor chained. Decades passed, then centuries, and yet the fires of Jerusalem, though long extinguished in stone, continued to burn in the minds of men. By the 2nd century CE, the empire that had once crucified Judea stood changed, not collapsed, not defeated, but transformed. From its eastern borderlands to the halls of the Senate, whispers of the rebellion had not died. They had grown teeth. They had become scripture, legend, blueprint. Rome had rebuilt the ruins of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, a sterile, Romanized colony. No Jews were allowed to enter, not even to mourn. Statues of Jupiter stood where the temple once rose. Latin echoed through marble streets, but beneath that marble, beneath every polished imperial column, was a memory Rome could not erase, the memory of a city that had refused to kneel. In the eastern provinces, where Jewish communities still thrived, the rebellion became sacred history. Songs were written, fast days observed, not for grief alone, but for pride. The tale of Shimon ben Giora, once just a general, was elevated to something more. A king, a prophet. For some, even a messianic figure whose spirit would return in another age, another war, another temple. But it wasn't only the Jews who remembered. In Alexandria, Stoic philosophers began citing the fall of Jerusalem as proof that empire, no matter how grand, could not crush virtue. In Athens, a young senator named Marcus Aurelius, still decades away from becoming emperor, read accounts of the siege not as military history, but as moral parable. He wrote in his private journals, "What is strength without meaning? What is rule without justice?" Even the ashes of a rebel city outshine the banners of conquest. Elsewhere, the stories evolved into strange new shapes. Among the rising Christian sects, the destruction of the temple was reframed, not as tragedy, but divine transition. They pointed to it as the end of the old covenant and the birth of the new. And yet, even these early Christians, once persecuted by Rome themselves, held deep respect for the rebels of Jerusalem. Martyrdom, they now understood, was not weakness. It was power in disguise. Meanwhile, in the Persian world, the Parthians never forgot their wartime ally. Judean veterans were honored at court. In some regions, Jewish self-rule was permitted under Parthian oversight for nearly a century. And in the Zoroastrian texts of the time, there are cryptic references to a flame people from the west, guardians of a sacred law who would someday return with fire and righteousness. By the 3rd century, the Roman world was no longer the same. Its borders strained, its gods questioned, its emperors assassinated with growing frequency. In this climate of uncertainty, ideas began to matter more than ever. And one idea, forged in the streets and temples of a fallen city, began to take root. The idea that truth is not measured by survival, that empire is not destiny, that faith, wielded with conviction, can be stronger than swords. And so, in hidden rooms in Antioch, in synagogues in Hispania, in stone houses clinging to the hills of Galilee, people told the story, again and again, of a people who rose not because they expected to win, but because they refused to surrender. Of a temple that burned, yes, but not before becoming the heart of a nation reborn. And of a revolt that failed in battle, but triumphed in memory, The descendants of the rebels would carry that memory across continents, into Europe, into North Africa, into Asia, and one day, many centuries later, back into the hills where it all began. Because if Jerusalem taught the world anything, it was this: empires rise and empires fall. But meaning endures, and meaning is a battlefield all its own. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire no longer ruled from a place of certainty. Constantinople had risen in the east. Christianity, once hunted, now wore the imperial crown. The gods of marble and thunder had faded into statues covered in moss. And yet, in the margins of this transformed world, an older fire still flickered. A fire lit not in cathedrals or palaces, but in memory. The Jewish revolt against Rome, though long extinguished in physical form, had become something larger. It was now legend, and in the changing spiritual and political landscape of late antiquity, that legend became a kind of code, a narrative whispered by rebels, reformers, and those who believed that power could be defied not just with weapons, but with will. Among Jewish communities scattered from North Africa to the Rhineland, the memory of Jerusalem's fall never dulled. The teachings born in Babylonian exile matured into the Talmud, a vast ocean of legal reasoning, philosophical inquiry, and coded history. Within its pages, the Great Revolt was rarely named directly, but its consequences were everywhere, in the laws of fasting, the ethics of war, the tension between survival and resistance. It wasn't just law, it was strategy. The sages understood. The revolt had failed to secure statehood, but had succeeded in preserving soulhood. So Judaism became mobile, modular, a temple that could travel, a people that could outlast any siege. In the Christian world, too, the revolt cast a long shadow. Church fathers debated its meaning endlessly. Some argued the destruction of the temple was divine judgment, a sign that the new covenant had replaced the old. Others, more cautiously, saw in Judea's last stand a dangerous parallel to their own growing movement. If Christians ever opposed imperial injustice, would they too be seen as rebels? As traitors? The fear lingered. And in this ambiguity, a strange synthesis emerged. Christianity borrowed the structure of Rome, but increasingly adopted the spirit of Jerusalem. It honored martyrs. It resisted paganism. It spoke of a kingdom not of this world, but one worth dying for. In this ideological crucible, the rebel became the prophet, the ruin became the symbol, and the story of a doomed revolt became the heartbeat of a new age. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, barbarians at its gates and rot in its core. The seeds planted by Jerusalem had already spread across 3 continents. A world once ruled by swords was now ruled by stories. And the story of a small people defying a global empire had become one of the most powerful of all. In Arabia, echoes of Judean resistance found new form. By the 7th century, Islam emerged, not merely as a faith, but as a civilizational force. Its early leaders were deeply aware of both Jewish and Christian traditions, and early Islamic narratives spoke respectfully of the people of the book, honoring their prophets, laws, and endurance. Some Quranic passages mention the children of Israel not with condemnation, but as examples of divine testing and moral strength. Though theological divides remained, the memory of Jerusalem, its sanctity, its suffering, was now sacred to all 3 Abrahamic traditions. The city became a crossroads of longing, of pilgrimage, of prophecy. And under Islamic rule, Jews in some parts of the Middle East found brief windows of security, if not sovereignty, but the idea of rebellion never vanished. In the forests of medieval Europe, Jewish communities kept records, not just of rituals, but of uprisings. They taught their children of Masada, of Shimon ben Giora, of the temple's fire. In whispered songs and coded prayers, they preserved the mindset of resistance. And when crusaders swept through the Levant centuries later, slaughtering both Muslims and Jews alike, some communities invoked the old mantra, "Better to fall with Jerusalem than kneel to Rome." And in secret, among mystics and poets, a new dream took form, that one day the memory would not only inspire, but return. That Jerusalem would rise again, not just in stone, but in sovereignty. Not merely as a site of mourning, but as a throne of meaning. And while kings and empires changed flags and religions over the centuries, that dream stayed rooted, sometimes smoldering, sometimes roaring. But always alive, the revolt may have ended in fire, but in its ashes, the world learned a terrifying truth, that even defeat, if it is righteous, can outlive victory. Time buries cities. It levels temples, erases borders, and folds empires into sediment and silence. Rome learned this. So did Babylon. So did Carthage. But Jerusalem refused. In our imagined timeline, where Judea held its ground and ignited a fire across the Roman East, we've traced a world reshaped, not just by conquest, but by resistance. And though that resistance ended in flames, the world that followed did not belong solely to the victors. It belonged to the memory, to the idea. Because the Jewish revolt, had it succeeded even briefly in overturning Roman rule, would have sent fault lines across the foundations of the ancient world. And indeed, it did in part, even in our real history. But in this alternate world, those tremors grew into continental shifts. Rome, bled and staggered, never regained full control of the East. Its authority waned not from external conquest, but internal erosion, provoked by its own brutality. Political trust frayed. Provinces hardened. The myth of invincibility, cracked open by Judean defiance, shattered entirely when Parthia pressed into Asia Minor, seizing territory once thought forever Roman. The idea of imperial permanence, of Caesar as an unshakable sun, dimmed. In its place came something far more unpredictable: faith. Jerusalem, though ruined, became the seed of spiritual revolution across the old world, not as a lone spark, but as a signal fire for a broader reckoning with what power meant. It taught rebels, prophets, monks, and mystics that martyrdom was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of story. That to lose with dignity was to win the future. And so the descendants of the survivors scattered not as victims, but as carriers of a mission. Their communities dotted the coasts of Africa, the hills of France, the trading ports of the East. Each bore not just scripture, but scars. They were living memory of a city, of a fire, of a stand taken when surrender would have been easier. And as time marched on, their memory shaped the world in ways swords never could. In monasteries, monks copied their legends. In mosques, scholars debated their courage. In the shadow of Gothic cathedrals, carved in stained glass, fragments of their stories appeared, sometimes twisted, often misunderstood, but always present. Even the empire that once sought their erasure changed. Christian Rome, the child of pagan Rome, absorbed the lesson of Jerusalem without ever admitting it. It adopted the rebel's virtue and draped it in imperial gold. The very church that crowned emperors built itself upon the bones of a people it once called enemy. But Jerusalem was never anyone's to own. Its meaning remained wild, unstable, alive. It became the hinge of prophecy, the fulcrum of holy wars, the dream that refused erasure. Crusaders marched for it, caliphs wept for it, monarchs bargained for it, and in back alleys, candlelit homes, and scattered academies, a simple vow echoed, next year in Jerusalem, not as nostalgia, as intent. Because even in this alternate history, where the revolt was not crushed so quickly, where Judea wrote its defiance across the map, the central truth remains. Empires fall, but ideas endure. And what if, just what if, the point of the revolt was never to win the war at all? What if its real victory was planting the seed of resistance that would blossom in every age thereafter? From Gandhi's Salt March to the Warsaw Ghetto, from the caves of Masada to the protests of modern squares, that seed grows still. It takes new forms. It wears new names. But the soil remembers, because somewhere, deep beneath the surface of history, Jerusalem continues to whisper, "You can burn our temples. You can break our walls. But you cannot kill who we are." So now we return to the question, what if the Jewish revolt had overthrown Roman rule? We've seen a world where a tiny nation shook an empire, where the fall of one city rewrote the faiths and futures of millions. We imagined what might have happened if Judea had stood longer, spoken louder, and survived not only in exile, but in sovereignty. Would you want to live in that world? A world where conviction held more weight than legions? A world born not from conquest, but from refusal? Or would that world be too fragile, too defiant, too human? The truth is, we still live with echoes of that alternate history, in our laws, in our faiths, in the architecture of resistance itself. Now, it's your turn. What do you think would have happened if the rebels had won? Let us know in the comments. What would your world look like if Jerusalem had never fallen? And remember, history is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. If you enjoyed this journey through alternate history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. We read every comment, and your ideas might inspire the next video.